what I feel like perhaps speaking today about is that maybe a little extension of what we have addressed at the gathering at the Memorial Center for Peace. As some of you have maybe noticed that there have been a lot of agitation and maybe even unrest, and it's very much with what's happening around the world. And if we are to apply the understanding that everything is interconnected anyway, everything is interconnected, then that will make it only natural. Then if there is some kind of agitation somewhere, it got to affect this being here. In other words, if there is conflict somewhere, that conflict would have to be experienced here as well, on some level, on whatever level. And I don't know if you have noticed that in recent days, like recent weeks, there have been a lot of this, not agitation, but a lot of people are drawn into very passionate discussions, very passionate arguments even. So why don't we talk about that a little bit? Sort of like bring it out into the open as a theme of how does that all connects and relates to us, to those of us who are spiritually aligned or aligned towards the realization of our innermost potential, towards the realization of our freedom, towards the realization of our essential nature. How does that all sit with us? How does that all relates? Does it relate at all to us, what's happening out there in the world? Should it relate to us? Should we pay attention to it? Are we better off ignoring it? This is what I want to bring out into the open, so that maybe then we can do a little bit of a meditation with certain intention. And before going into this theme, really, I want to share something which is actually based on very careful observation that I myself have embarked upon, and at some point consciously, because what I've noticed, and I say at a certain point, at a certain phase of my own spiritual endeavors, of my own spiritual practice, is that every time there is an unrest, or if there is a certain kind of agitation, I call it, but that agitation, if we want to be more specific, if there is a rise of violence, if there is an increase of conflict, doesn't matter in what part of the world, but if that conflict is being then brought into the news, into the domain of the discussion, it generates certain energy, obviously. And when I was exposed to that, I would always notice how in that state, in that, let's call it a tender state of awakening, still tender because a lot of processes are at work, the energy field itself is amplified. So I remember how hearing the news on some cataclysmic event here, or some disaster happened there, how it would affect the state of my consciousness. Actually down to how it would affect the very state of my nervous system. And this is something that I didn't want to ignore, because there was a simply, once it happened, twice it happened, it happened a couple of times, and I've noticed that there is an ongoing pattern, and very, very something which correlates. And very often when I am completely not exposed to the news, the system picks it up anyway. It picks it up because this is a proof of the fact that we all are interconnected to such degree that if something happening somewhere, it has to, if we apply that understanding, that is, relate to this body on some level. Because otherwise there is a total autonomy of this body from the rest, from the environment. Would that not be obvious conclusion? If I was this autonomous being, then that is an easy fact to accept. Why should it affect me one way or the other if I'm an autonomous being? And if I'm not an autonomous being, if I'm connected to my environment, then to what degree am I connected to this environment? And when we go into the exploration of this theme, we are bound to stumble into some really profound revelations. And I would like to talk about this a little bit today. In light of these recent events that happen around the world, and there's no need to beat about the bush, there is this rise of agitation and rise of violence that we are currently undergoing and experiencing. It manifests itself in various ways, not just necessarily what happened just recently in Gaza or what has been happening in Ukraine earlier. When we first, for instance, flew from Central America to first to California, the world was dominated by the news and the events taking place in Ukraine. And people were fanning this and viewing this conflict from various perspectives. I'm not here to push you into some kind of on trying to initiate a political discussion of who is right here, who is wrong here. I will keep these views to myself. But what I would like to bring out into the open is that nothing out there in the world happens outside of the register of this nervous system. And the sensitivity of the field, of the amplification of the field, is very often the criteria of our own awakening, at least throughout a certain phase of this process. In other words, we could become quite sensitive to what is happening out there. And indeed, I've encountered a lot of examples when people, awakened people, not just consciousness dormant, completely satisfied with just this very, very placid inertia of just this physical level of existence, but people awaken to the whatever degree, how they have been affected by exposure of what would be perceived as injustice, conflict, and so forth. Simply because there is this receptivity is on the increase. The receptivity is there to a greater degree because the field itself is amplified. And I will tell you even more. There are periods when you actually feel not just so-called man-made conflicts, because it's just this is why it's in the inverted commas, because although we could say these are man-made conflicts, but that would be with reference to a specific, let's say, from the point of view of the common language. Because nothing is really man-made, or, obviously we would have to take that and view that from the greater perspective, from the perspective of the consciousness itself. However, for the moment, I'm just inviting you to see this from the point of view of how, when something happens, and it could happen even on a level of the weather, it could happen on a level of what happens in the geomagnetic field of Earth. Like there is a period when there was a phase when I was acutely aware of very powerful earthquakes just before they come. And when I shared that, I've realized that I'm not alone. There were quite few people who have been experiencing that for years, for many years. There's a specific, very easily identified sensations, even on the level of the body. The pressure, the kind of like because it's all interconnected. All absolutely interconnected. The amplified field of this consciousness embodied, and the field of the planet Earth, and they are obviously not two separate things. But I want us to speak about this from practical perspective, from how does that sit and how does that relate to us, beings who are conscious, or beings in whom consciousness is more evolved than just to take sides and to blame, which sometimes also important. It's not that we completely live in that oblivion. Then when we're witnessing an act, when we become witness of an act which we feel is not just, it invokes a certain response. Doesn't matter whether we make actual move and speak out or do anything about it. It still evokes and invokes a certain response, a certain reaction. And many of you, I'm sure, have noticed that there is direct correlation between something happening out there in the world and when there's a disbalance, let's say, a temporal disbalance. Things are wobbling. Then we feel more wobbled. We feel more out of tune. We feel more agitated. No man is an island, right? As the writer has said. No man is an island. So let this be a little improvised theme that I felt simply because there is so many dialogues that have been brought to my attention just recently. So many dialogues and exchanges. So what is the position of a spiritually minded being? What do we meant to do? What is our responsibility? Because this theme squarely relates, or roundly relates, if you will, to what we have spoken and Center for Peace.
There's a story, and I don't know if I'll get it right, but I seem to recall when I was younger, the story of the Fall of Lucifer as the God's angel. And the story was that after, in the traditional account of God creating Adam and Eve, he had asked the angels to pay homage to his new creation. And it was said that Lucifer was so proud, he looked upon the creation of man and woman as a flawed, beneath the level of an angel to be worshipping. And so his disobedience to God was what cast him from heaven. He said, like, these are inferior beings, I can't. I pay homage to you, God. I give all my devotion to you. So it was kind of an interesting twist. And to me, when I hear that story, in relationship to what you've talked about, when we're on a spiritual path, it's very easy to isolate oneself from that hubbub of world events, because we see that as kind of the machinations of humanity not really paying attention. And then we sort of, I know friends who are like that too. They isolate themselves and they divorce themselves from having anything to do with it. They just say, that's the world of ignorance. We're not on that path. We're just going to stay where we're at. So my question is, and I've asked one Buddhist teacher this question one time, what should we do, and how much should we do? Because that's always also part of the question. And he said, only do that which you feel you can handle. Do that as much as you can do, but do no more. If you could extend, some people become involved in a campaign of some sort, and they become fanatics, and then they lose perspective. And so there's a kind of a balance between, see, the Lucifer story, where I'm not having anything to do with this humanity business. On the other hand, seeing that humanity is crying out for assistance, and knowing that, if a man is starving and he needs some bread, it's fine to talk about teaching him how to grow wheat, but in immediacy he needs bread. You can teach him eventually how to grow wheat, but it's not an immediate thing. So there's discernment on that level. And the last thing I'll say is that in politics, when I worked for politicians in the past, one particular fellow that I worked for, he was always getting his fingers in every pie. He was like a hummingbird, going from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing to thing. And we kept telling him, it's fine to have all this interest and compassion and trying to help, but you can't be effective if you just go to 1, 2, 10 things. Just focus on a few things, become very good at those things, and then at least you'll be effective. So I see in all those stories something about recognizing what it is we can do. And sometimes it's just that even our meditative practice, indirectly, if we're affected by these events, similarly if we take into our heart that sense of the pain of people, we can be responding in that manner as well as direct action, whether it's letter writing but not just to ignore maybe all events, to try to transform, sort of like a giving back vibration. If we receive something, like Tuamling practice in Buddhism, you breathe in the pain of the world, and you exhale love and compassion and kindness. And you take in, so how that's transformed, I don't know, but it's my sense of how, and you may have some thoughts on that.
Wise response of that Buddhist teacher. Certainly, do what you can handle, right? Always do what you can handle. You see, here, what I want to draw our attention is that if we apply this understanding that in here and out there is literally a temporarily perceived phenomena, then everything that happens on whatever level somehow deeply interconnected. And one of the, what I call a mark of a seasoned spiritual warrior, is the recognition that whenever there is a conflict on whatever level, then there is still some work needs to be done. In other words, anything that we recognize that out there that isn't perfect would have to be immediately addressed here, because it is from here, from this alchemical lab, that we can reach out the most healing touch. And that not to discard what you said earlier in relation to that if someone is hungry, right, you cannot feed them philosophy. They need to have bread. This is obvious. But here, what I often encounter is a misunderstanding of the hidden potential that each and every one embodies. So in other words, this, what we speak about here, would maybe fall flat on the ears of those who are not prepared to hear this message. So each one acts from their level of understanding and from their level of awareness, of course. But if there is a conflict, if there is a rise in violence, it is immediate invitation to look in and see how I can reconcile it within here. Because whether we experience it directly or not at this stage, every fluctuation in our state affects that particular something that is happening in space-time convention. Something happening out there, right? The shelling of rockets addressed completely disproportionately to where not necessarily terrorists are hiding, but those are the most vulnerable, right? So when faced with that, obviously this brings out very, very powerful emotions, very powerful feelings. And at some point, I would say that when we are not ready to be exposed to this, we're not ready to deal with that, just like in vein of what that Buddhist teacher said, deal with what you can handle. There's no point to get upset about it if there's nothing you can do about it. But what I'm bringing it here is that what we can do about it. Because certainly we can do something about it. Certainly we can do something about it, precisely because this particular understanding, this particular teaching, applies that not everything as it should be. In other words, even when things as they are, as they should be, there is a possibility of implementing this potential present in human consciousness, which can have a healing touch. So in other words, we take this from the level of discussion where what we've talked about, right, in relation to what really the definition of peace and how to live in harmony, where it rests. And we apply it here in a concrete situation. And I remember very well when someone like Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, for instance, whenever there would be an explosion of some sorts in the world, in the outer events, there would be immediately a certain action applied, usually by urging people to gather and meditate, to spend more time in silence, to avoid conflicts, even on a level of smallest conflicts here. Because everything adds. When the balance is very, very delicate, when the balance is very, very tender, everything, like on the scale where everything is being weighed all the time, one drop makes the difference. And it is literally that drop we're talking about here. That inner status, that feeling, even on the level of the feeling, how we feel. So, to say it in a very different way, our primal responsibility here is to remain in balance. And not only that, is to actually remain in a happy state of mind. It's to remain and to pursue happiness. Because what I hear a lot about is that people take all this pain onto their heart, right? And just go into the Facebook, go into the blogs, go in and see what's going on. And people just, and I'm not talking about randomly, I'm talking about people who have been around, who have been treading the path. And all they do, they lock themselves into these arguments where they get passionate, where they get agitated, where they get angry. It does not help a bit. It's actually counterproductive. And it is this is to be happy, no matter what, is really one of the most subtlest things to understand. Because it almost goes against the grain of how come all these things happen, in the world, and almost like feeling guilty to be happy, right? Feeling like, But I'm going to give you a very, very direct and kind of basic example. If there are starving children in Africa, do you go into starvation to keep to feel kind of an empathy? Is that going to help in any way? In what way is it going to help? Because that's exactly the same attitude when and if we are faced with injustice, when and if we are faced with escalation of violence. If what we add to it is of the same quality, then we do not at all contribute to any qualitative change in the situation, of the qualitative change in the condition. It's simple, because like increases like. Even by drop, by little, anything that is just increases, it increases that. And it only escalates that. So this is what we want to look into. We want to look into that. That is the subtle message. So whenever something happens in the world, and it reaches us, this agitation, how do I feel? Pay attention. How do I feel about it? Yes, I'm moved. Yes, on the surface level, this should not happen. It's not right. But go deeper. Don't just stay there. Where does it take you? What do you feel? How does it actually feel in the body? Where does it feel in the body? How does it sit there? And to find that place where you can put even one foot, that literally that where the light is, even if you can put just one foot and rest temporarily. This is our responsibility. This is the responsibility of a spiritually minded being, is to introduce a qualitatively different response. And that response is nowhere out there, it's here. Because if I do not embody this, I cannot possibly bring any qualitative or lasting change, or I cannot help, because even if I jump into actions that are the most meretricious on the surface of it, if my state of consciousness is not resting in qualitatively different level of consciousness, then it is of little value. This, of course, has to be experienced. This, of course, has to be a lived reality. But sometimes, like, take it for granted. It's that part, which at a later stage would not be refuted.